Welcome to the Ancients. Today we have a special treat because I am joined by my esteemed, but sometimes confused when it comes to dates, colleague Matt Lewis, historian and host of the Gone Medieval podcast, to have a frank discussion on the most awkward period in Western history. We're talking about a messy 500-year-long process between 300 and 850 AD, which my people might call the decline and fall of the ancient world, the end of antiquity. His people, however, call it the early Middle Ages. We know this is a deeply nuanced and complex period that evolved uniquely across different places and at different paces. The world didn't just go to sleep one night ancient and wake up the next day medieval. Listen, I know that, Matt knows that, you know that. However, our producers want to fight and have placed in my hand a stack of key people and events for us to battle over and claim for our own. We will be debating whether these moments represent collapse or continuity. This could get ugly, but HR is on standby. Matt, great to have you on the show. Are you ready for it?
It's fantastic to be here. Let's go.
Matt, how are you feeling?
I feel like this is going to be descending into a punch-up. I've bought some protection.
Yes.
So I've bought my helmet. I'm ready for a dust-up.
I also didn't want it to sound too on the head, saying that you're often mistaken, because you're not. You just might be with some of the dates that we're discussing
Frequently
today.
deluded, maybe.
Okay. Well, if you're that, imagine what I'm going to be. Okay, so... but this is very exciting to finally have you on the Ancients. And always, is this like a Gone Medieval Ancients crossover?
It's just like the superhero crossover that no one dared to put together before.
Yeah, because they hadn't heard of it, but now they have, and it's gonna hit the airwaves like nothing before. And it is such an interesting period. I must admit, my main area being, I guess, outside doing the general interviews, being much earlier on with like Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic period, but still being fascinated in actually figuring out when antiquity ends and it being so often linked to ancient Rome and the Roman Empire and when the Middle Ages begins. It's a fascinating kind of period to talk about.
It is, and I'm in the same boat in that if I'm an expert in anything, it's the late medieval period. So I'm working backwards to try and work out how we arrived at the late medieval period. But we've both spoken to a lot of incredibly clever people about this mushy area in the middle. And I think we can hopefully try and glean what's yours and what's mine. Like you say, we've had fisticuffs before in the office about
we have stay away from this topic or that topic, isn't it? But it's always all's fair in love and war. That's the quote. I think also the fact that this will be our enthusiasts' opinions on the matter. There'll be lots of avenues for disagreement and encourage people to comment and, give their thoughts as well.
Yeah. Fight us in the comments.
Absolutely. Like, the team have given us a number of cards. We don't know what's on them. I certainly don't know unless you've had a peek. But my hunch is that there'll probably be a proposal, a series of dates and statements. And we have to decide whether it's ancient or medieval territory, and we can fight it out. So with all that being said, shall we get into it?
Let's get stuck in.
All right. Okay. This feels like going quite far ahead. So we've got an 8th century date, first of all. We've got 732 AD.
You're not having that. Get out.
I don't think I can claim that anyway. And it's got the Battle of Tours and Charles Martel. So this is very much early medieval territory. I'm not going to fight this one.
Okay. So we're on the verge of the emergence of a Frankish nation and those kinds of ideas of the coming together of those fractured small kingdoms that had emerged after the fall of Rome. And Charles Martel is fighting battles against Islam coming in from southern Spain and all of those kinds of things as well. So there's a little bit in there about the friction between Christianity and Islam early on, a little bit about defining nationhood and all of that kind of thing. But I feel like that's firmly medieval territory and you need to back off.
I mean, completely. You've had the spread of Islam already, haven't you? And, all the way to Morocco and then into Spain. If there were any Frankish leaders who I could contest and maybe say is in the ancient world still, maybe Clovis, early on in the forming of the Frankish kingdom. But you're right, isn't it? It's that transition from that mosaic of different barbarian Visigoths, Burgundians, Frankish kingdoms into something the more powerful, like the Frankish kingdom that becomes France.
And I guess maybe you would put it in there because this is when the map of Western Europe starts to look a little bit more like something we would recognise. You can almost plot France on a map and that kind of thing. But I feel like there is a lot of medieval territory to get there.
So there's a statement here. It's like, sets in stone the borders of medieval Western Europe. Do we think that's fair with the Battle of Tours, how seismic it is?
I mean, they're always moving a little bit, but it is in terms of, the Muslims who were in southern Spain will remain there for 700 years after this battle. So it does settle the limits of where Islam is encroaching into southern Iberia. And as I say, around the time of Charles Martel, you've got something that looks very much like France beginning to emerge. But nothing else is very settled yet, I don't think.
No, completely. I don't think we need to hand any more time on this because I'm not contesting it. That's yours. There you go. Yeah. You can take it. But you get the Ancients logo on there.
We're keeping score. Is that 1-0?
I guess that's 1-0. I think that's not really fair though. So 3280. Well, let's see what the next one is. Okay, this is more interesting. And this is one I certainly will fight for. 476 AD. Now, does that ring a bell?
So that's the fall of the Roman Empire?
Fall of the Western Roman Empire. Well, it's the date of, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, giving up his throne, abdicating to Odoacer. And then, there was no further Western Roman emperor. But of course, the Roman Empire does continue at pace in the East. I think it's Emperor Zeno who's ruling at the time. And Odoacer, of all people, actually then seeks kind of almost, dare I say, permission from the Emperor Zeno, and what to do in Italy. So there's still very much respect to that Roman rule there in the East, and it's still as strong as ever, which is why I would say that this is still ancient history. Few people, there's a tendency to say that, is this actually the cutoff point? If people want to pinpoint a date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD is the traditional date.
Yeah, it's one of those really convenient pins in the map that you can put on a timeline and you can just hang the division between ancient and medieval on that. But if I was to suggest that that's becoming a medieval period, I would suggest that we have previously had problems for Rome. Rome has been sacked. Rome is already a lame duck. It's just waiting to be put out of its misery, I guess.
Completely. I remember talking to Dr. David Gwynn about this in another filmed episode on the origins of Rome for that series. Well, on the fall of Rome, the origins of the fall of Rome, a series we did earlier this year. And also Adrian Goldsworthy, he talked about this as well. Basically highlighting, as you say, the emperor's a lame duck by this point. It's the power of the foederati, these people who are serving, are in the service of these figureheads, but they've had power for some time, and Odoacer just decides there's actually no need for this little kid anymore. But it's certainly not the end of ancient history, I would argue, at that time, because there's no kind of dissolution of Roman beliefs or values. The mosaic of kingdoms that emerges in Western Europe at that time, as we talked, like the Visigoths in Spain, you ultimately get the Ostrogoths and Theodoric the Great in Italy, and Clovis and the Franks. They're still got clear, kind of embracing of Roman values and ideas. They haven't just there's no kind of clear cut-off point. The only exception to that, we might explore this later, is Britain, where there is a clearer cut-off point. So I would say that the whole of the 5th century, if we're taking a Eurocentric view, which I think we largely will be with terms like medieval and ancient, aren't we? In that sphere, I think I would argue that the whole of the 5th century on the continent, European continent at least, is still ancient history.
It's a tricky one though, isn't it? Because what leads to Rome falling in 476? It's the emergence of a different mindset, a different way of doing things that has been attacking Rome for decades by this point. So something has changed. Something in the way that people are living has changed. And I think it's important, we are going to be mainly in Western Europe. So the medieval period is a term for Western Europe, really. And we're not talking about everyone going to bed wearing togas and waking up in the morning thinking, well, that's stupid, I'm going to put some hose on and dress completely differently. It's not like an overnight thing. But if I was going to make a claim on 476 tipping over into the medieval world, it's that it's a medieval mindset that has already emerged that is causing Rome to be dragged down.
That is a good point. And maybe that kind of harkens back to the overarching idea that it is a transitional phase, over a long period of time. It is complicated, it's complex. and maybe 476, well, actually, almost likely, certainly, it's nearer the beginning than the end of that whole transitional phase, I'd argue, which will go into the 6th century as well. I'm sure we'll visit it in time. So, as you're right, the forming of the medieval world is certainly there by this point, with, as you say, those kingdoms like the Visigoths and the Franks and so on. But I wouldn't say that this is clear-cut medieval like that one is. So I would say that, yes, maybe it is in the transitional phase, but I would still put it in ancient territory. Would you give me it?
I'll give you a 1-1.
A 1-1. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you're a Birmingham City fan, so you need every help you can get.
So good. 111 points last season. Not so good this season. Too used to winning. That's the problem. Right. Should we move on to the next one?
What have we got?
Okay. I'm a bit more confident about this one. We're going back to the 3rd century. So 286 AD. So a bit of context, because I know this is really out of your comfort zone. Okay. This is a period, this is known as the end of the 3rd century crisis. So this is a time, kind of a period roughly of 50 years where you've had more than 25 emperors rise and fall. I think only one dies of natural causes. The rest are done away with, either assassinations, poisonings, or killed in battle and usurpers and so on. It's epitomized as a period of great instability where the Roman Empire could easily have fallen and was close to falling. And there were certain points in the 3rd century where the Roman Empire is divided into 3. When you have like breakaway states like Palmyra in the east with Zenobia, and the Gallic Empire, Britain as well, kind of is cut away. But it holds together because you do see, and once again, this is largely regurgitating the work of the brilliant Dr. David Gwynn, who did a lovely interview about this. You have the works of figures like 2 particular emperors, Gallienus and Aurelian, who work hard to kind of reform and sort out the empire when it's at its weakest in the 260s and 70s, and it unites. So the Roman Empire does come through this period of crisis. And arguably, well, not arguably at all, by the time you do get to the 4th century, it's stronger than ever. An everyday Roman wouldn't have thought that their empire was in decline at that point.
Yeah, I was going to ask the question as to whether that could be viewed as the beginning of the end, if it was a moment of crisis that saw a lot of reshaping. But if the Roman Empire is coming out of it stronger, I guess it's more difficult for me to position it as the beginning of the end and perhaps the beginning of the emergence of.
No, but you are kind of right, because this is kind of the clear cut-off point where we say, like, now this is late antiquity, right? This is away from your time of your Marcus Aurelius's, your Septimius Severus's, Trajan, Hadrian. This is a time when Christianity is about to come to the fore. You have more clear-cut divisions of power, I would argue as well. There's more often than not times where you have multiple emperors. Of course, the end of the 3rd century is defined by the Tetrarchy, which is Diocletian dividing the empire first into 2, Senior Augusti, and then into 4 with 2 junior rulers as well.
Which in some ways is a precedent for what will come later with the splintering of small petty kingdoms emerging. You've suddenly got this idea that there isn't one single figure who rules over everything in a divinely appointed kind of way. There is an idea that there can be a separation of all of that, and that there can be more than one ruler ruling over this whole territory, which is where the medieval mind gets to with the splintering of all of this and all the small petty kingdoms that kind of, when the Roman Empire smashes apart, it's like 1,000 pieces of glass, and eventually it starts being pieced together. But it sounds like maybe this is the beginning of that.
I think you're quite right.
It's the end of the idea that only one person needs to rule all of this.
Yeah, I mean, there will be some exceptions. I mean, the rule of Constantine the Great, of course, Theodosius the Great as well. But usually they find that the empire is just too big, that one person can't deal with it, the fracturing of it. And yes, that will then just kind of go to the next level as you get to the 5th century. And then, it's funny, this idea of breakaway states is nothing new to the Romans by the time they get to the 4th century. As I mentioned Britain earlier, look at Carausius, and who led a breakaway state in Britain right around this time, 286. But as you say, it just becomes more, I guess, the norm.
It sounds like there's a recognition from the centre as well, rather than it being someone breaking away and Rome needing to drag them back into compliance.
Yes.
There's a recognition at the centre in Rome that more than one person is maybe needed to rule all of this.
Yes, and then sometimes there are times where they have too much on their plate that they can't. I mean, Rome and Britain, look to your own defences and all that kind of stuff, right? See Agrius in northern France.
Sounds dangerously medieval.
Yes. It would be a bit weird if this is the problem with dates, because if I then said, you've also put a good argument there for like, you can see kind of formations of medieval world even back in the late 3rd century. But if I've already gone for 476, we'd have to do a renegotiation if you then say that this is medieval. I don't think that'd be quite fair. But
No.
what do you think about it?
It's going to have to be an ancient, I think. That's going to have to be an ancient date. But I think it really plays into this idea that it's a much longer transition than we think it is, that it's going to become harder and harder to hang it off one date, whether that's 476 or any other date. We're looking at a whole period of cultural, societal, political change and evolution rather than a single cut-off date. It's going to make the rest of this chat quite tricky.
I mean, completely. And I would also argue a transition, but getting out of this linear idea that it's a downward decline consistently. The transition, you could argue, is starting by the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th century. But Rome is, yes, although there's the division of power, yes, the army's different to the one you might think from Gladiator and the like, but is it actually weaker? You could argue absolutely not. The amount of, it's still a strong entity. It is just changing in its format. Key period, which will ultimately you will see evidence of enduring into the medieval world. Right, okay, on to the next one. So, 410 AD. So this is one where we can negotiate stuff around if we feel we need to. Do you know anything about 410 AD?
Is this a sack of Rome?
It is the sack of Rome. The first
A sack of Rome.
A sack of Rome.
But do it more than once. Surely.
But psychologically, this is the hammer blow. Like, this is the first time Rome has been sacked in some 700 years since the Gauls under a guy called Brennus in around 390 BC, right? So Rome has forged an empire in that time in the Republican period. It's defeated all the old great enemies like Hannibal, the Macedonians, Cleopatra, Augustus, the Trajan. All those big names have existed in that more than half a century since Rome itself was assaulted and, kind of subjected to a military attack, in what the Romans would have considered ancient history.
And is this the Vandals? Is 410 the Vandals?
Wash your mouth out with soap. How dare you? No. This is the Goths.
The Goths.
Visigoths, I guess you could say. Visigoths is more later. We'll just say the Goths. The Vandals is later, though, and you do hit an important point. I think that's 456. But Rome is sacked twice in the period of 50 years. And actually that Vandal sack of Rome by Gaiseric and the Vandals is worse than the 410 sack in regards to the devastation and destruction. But the 410 one by Alaric and his followers is, as I said, psychologically a hammer blow because it's that first time Rome has actually been attacked and sacked. I don't think the sacking is that brutal. I'm sure people will disagree. It said, I'm not a leading expert. I'm just trying to remember what David Gwynn told me, as he's one of the leading lights on this, and Peter Heather as well. We interviewed both pretty recently on it. But Rome,
it's the fact of Rome being sacked, not how badly it was sacked. It's the fact that there is now a rival making its way into the very heart of the Roman Empire, which again, as we talked about with 476, this plays into the idea that something has already changed and happened for the Goths to be there to assault Rome. Are the Goths a medieval people? Because if they're a medieval people attacking Rome, are we in the medieval world?
Well, are the Goths a medieval people? I don't think you could say that. But it's like the beginning of a trend of mass migrations into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire's dealt with migrations before and, brought people in. There's been trouble on the frontiers before. They've always brought people in, but it's the scale of them now that's, sending them over the edge. Poor decision-making as well. I mean, the reason that Alaric and the Goths ultimately end up there is they've already had quite a gazump, shall we say, or a blitz around the Balkans and the Eastern Roman Empire, the defeat of the Valens at the Battle of Adrianople a few decades earlier. But the point I was going to say is it's not that brutal a sacking. They don't attack the churches. The Goths are Christian. Alaric had been trying to avoid a sack of Rome. He'd been negotiating with the emperor. The emperor's not there. Rome has lost its part of its importance is gone by the early 5th century. Ravenna and Milan have been kind of new centres of power for the rulers in the West. Rome is symbolic. It's the symbolic nature of it that is so devastating. But I think there's a point there in the fact that, it is the start of a trend.
It feels like maybe 410 is the alarm clock going off and the Roman Empire kind of rolling over and hitting snooze.
Yes.
But maybe they should have woken up a bit earlier.
I think so. Well, whether they could have, because, of course, by 410, you've also got other groups crossing the Rhine a couple of years earlier. Does Rome have the capacity in the West to deal with all these different threats? You have the Huns as well. They'll also invade Italy. Attila will invade Italy as well for a bit as well. So, as you say, it's the start of a process where Italy is no longer the safe area, no one can touch. It's the flourishing centre. It does hammer away the invincible nature of Rome and this idea, which I think was very much there in most people's minds, apart from a select few. I think Augustine of Hippo's one, no one could fathom the Roman Empire falling. It just wasn't in their vocabulary. And then this maybe sets a few more alarm bells ringing that maybe we're seeing the transition into something different, which maybe could that kind of go into the point of a medieval world coming? Yeah.
The medieval world is coming for Rome, and this is it entering Rome, sacking Rome, and proving itself a rival for Rome.
Interesting. Have you got any other thoughts on this from your medieval mindset?
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, my impression is as well that some of I guess part of the question is, what are we talking about changing when we think about changing to the medieval world? And there's a degree to which it's about a little bit of trade and commerce and stuff as well, in that it feels to me, as a complete non-expert, like Rome has become the centre of consumption, but it produces absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So we're moving to an economy in which, rather than rich people producing everything that they need on their own villas and estates and buying in everything from abroad, we're changing to a place in which people are indulging in commerce and trade on a much wider scale, and producing things and making things. And has that happened yet? I don't think it has.
I think you're quite right. But it is just one of those standout dates, isn't it, that we often associate with the end of ancient Rome. And I'm as guilty as anyone to love a solid date for something. It's like if you wanted to pinpoint a date, we talked earlier about 476 being like the end of the Roman Empire in the West. I think 410 is another one of those because, as you say, nothing completely different has changed as such. The Goths will go away, but they will then pave out their own kingdom in southern France.
Yeah.
That lays the future for the Visigoths in Spain, right? And so that's very medieval times. Yeah, from my perspective, it'd be interesting to see what people think. 476, if you did an episode on 476 on Gone Medieval, I might be like, okay, but I get it. I completely understand it because I can see the point being made that, it's a date which we pinpoint to the end of antiquity. It's certainly now actually within that transitional phase to what we see as the medieval times. 410, I'd probably be a bit like, not sure about that.
It's almost like you doing an episode about the worst year to be alive in the 6th century.
Maybe we'll get to that in a bit. Yeah, exactly. You're quite right. Or even maybe events in the early 7th century in West Asia.
I think I'm going to have to let you keep that one, though. I think I'm going to have to take another hit on this.
I'm piling up quite a few here at the moment. But, 476...
Does 476 go in the middle?
No, I've just seen that I've missed a card, which might actually make us understand more. Hang on. Yeah, 410, 286. Yeah, those are my two. I've lost somewhere. 476 is gone. All of a sudden, by magic.
Playing card. This is card scamming here. This is like dodgiest poker game ever.
Lo and behold. Can you tell I'm not an expert at this? We're just card dealing at the moment. So 476 I must have put it in here somewhere. There it is. And lo and behold, another card has appeared, which we should now revisit. Emperor Justinian, which is, this is all bets are off, fisticuffs. You could be coming for me with this one. Make your case.
We've done an episode on Gone Medieval with the wonderful Peter Saris. That is my case. Hand it over. Justinian is a really, really interesting one. So Byzantine emperor, effectively emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. So we have to concede here that the Roman Empire still exists in its Eastern form. Justinian is really interesting. He goes through phases of trying to recapture the Roman Empire, but only parts of it that are economically important. So around the Mediterranean fringe, the south of Spain and Italy and the north of Africa, he seems to have recognised that you need to cut some of the provinces loose that aren't bringing in enough money, and he focuses his efforts on getting back definitely Italy, which is the spiritual heart of the Roman Empire, but the rest of his efforts are focused on the bits that make money.
North Africa, isn't it, that area?
And southern Spain, and he's really keen to get those back in order to fund his own imperial exercise in the east. Justinian is really interesting though, because I think we have someone here who is thoroughly and devotedly Christian in a very medieval sense. So lots of the early doctrine that we get and lots of the early theological debates about medieval Christianity come from Justinian's court. What we think of largely as a lot of Roman law and jurisprudence is what Justinian distills it down to. And it again emerges from his court. So Justinian law will form the basis of European civil law for more than a millennium after him. It's still the basis of some systems of civil law in Europe today. So here is a man who is, literally sitting in his office with a bit of paper designing the medieval world.
So interesting, isn't it? God, when you put it like that, he is seismic for that change and everything he goes to as well. It almost feels like part of it, he is hearkening back to the ancient Roman heyday and, as I said, reclaiming those lands, seeing him just as the clear successor, but him personally transforming the world around him.
Yeah, and his background, I think, is interesting as well. He comes from an incredibly impoverished family in the Balkans. His uncle goes off to the imperial court, rises in the imperial guard, calls for his nephew. I can get him a job over here, get him a good education, and so he rises from complete obscurity and poverty to become the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And there's a medieval story in that, because what is the early medieval period but the fight for the right to rule everywhere, where almost anybody, if you're smart enough or strong enough, can become a king.
I would argue you can see that also, though, in the late period of ancient history as well, with usurpers and the like. But maybe, as you say, Justinian is just another, like a case of that to an extreme, because of how powerful, an empire he rules. It is interesting to think of whether the change from antiquity to medieval period, you really see a big spark in that during Justinian's reign, and by infamous events like the Justinian plague, the plague Justinian that breaks out, because of how devastating it is, because of how something like that's it is a Black Death plague, isn't it? Carried by the fleas on rats, and it's
it's believed to be a bubonic plague, the same kind of thing as the Black Death that comes
as Dr. Karl Harper talks about it.
What's more medieval than a plague?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, but it does, I mean, the law code and everything as well, I'm no expert on this, but it does feel that you have that conglomeration of game-changing events that happen in his long reign, that you do see Rome is never the same again, in a way, right?
Yeah, I think I would argue that Justinian is someone who, and I would also concede here that the ancient world kind of never goes away in the medieval world.
Yeah.
Medieval people would never have called themselves medieval. They wouldn't have been looking for dates like this. They see a degree of continuity, and they are obsessed with ancient Rome, with the architecture, with building in stone as a projection of power that never ever goes away. Particularly later in the medieval period, when Western Europe comes back into contact with ancient Greek and Roman writings after the Crusades, they are absolutely obsessed with all of that. And we get Romanesque architecture, building castles and churches, because they're obsessed. So it isn't that people suddenly turn away from the ancient world. The question is this a medieval man living in an ancient world, or an ancient man living in a medieval world?
That's so interesting.
And I would argue that he is a medieval man who is reshaping his empire to fit with the new medieval world that is around him.
I think that's spot on. As someone, I can agree. I can see the logic of that, but I can't say I think that's spot on from a degree of authority. But I can see what you mean. And it is the case, isn't it? When I think of Justinian, I might also think of the Nika riots. But of course, that's a chariot race, isn't it? It was from a chariot race, and you think chariots, you think ancient Rome. So you can see the ancient elements still there. I think Belisarius is sometimes dubbed like the last Roman, but there's always so many people who are dubbed the last Roman. But in like kind of, I think, a classical ancient sense, that last attempt to retake those former Roman lands in the heartlands of North Africa and Sicily and Italy.
I think with Justinian, what you get is a desire to still connect with all of that from the past, but a recognition that there's now a new way of doing everything.
And the fact that, it doesn't last. Because you have all those other new powers who are much stronger than they were before, north of the Alps, the Lombards and Franks and so on and so forth, who, kind of make that not be the case, that they lose Italy quite soon afterwards. I think I can give you this. I think so. Yes. I think that's more. I have no regrets about doing 541 AD, the worst year in history, on the Ancients podcast, because I think you can say that there is still an ancient world before the bubonic plague.
Yeah,
but
I think Justinian is an interesting figure to hang a discussion around the fact that that transition from ancient to medieval must happen in different places at different times at different paces. Again, we're not talking about, the sun goes down on one day on an ancient world and rises on a medieval one.
Yeah, completely. Should we do the next one?
Let's go for it.
Oh, this should be quite easy. Charlemagne. I'm not claiming him.
You don't want to?
No, not at all. When is he? How much further on is he?
So we're around 800 here. Here's his coronation in the year 800. And I guess why he's in there is because he will have himself crowned as Holy Roman Empire, as a Roman emperor. He is making the first maybe serious effort to reconfigure, to rebuild what was once the Western Roman Empire. He has what we would call today all of kind of Germany to France and all of the bits and pieces in between. He brings all of those back together and is keen to identify himself as a successor to Rome. So clearly in Charlemagne's mind, the ancient world still means something.
Yeah.
It's something that you still want to recapture. It still symbolizes power and authority and continuity and certainty and strength and all of those things that a king and emperor will want to project. But again, is he just using all of those notions to give him a step up in the medieval world?
Yeah, I think that just further affirms that this is very much a medieval period because they're hearkening back to the memory of something now gone. And also, who crowned Charlemagne?
The Pope.
The Pope, exactly. Something completely alien to, ancient rulers, I'd say. So I'm not disputing that at all. He's clearly a medieval figure. I guess one of the big titans of early medieval history, right?
He is. He's absolutely huge. And, engaging in thoroughly medieval battles, what we would recognize as medieval battles.
How big are these battles? Are they on the scale of ancient Rome?
Probably not, no. We're in a time period. It's hard to get numbers for medieval battles. It's probably easier for some Roman battles than it is for some medieval battles. They're notoriously bad at giving us numbers. And so it gets really, really difficult to pin them down. But you're quite often, in this kind of period, you're quite often talking about handfuls of knights on horses. It could be 20, 30 people who are the serious elite involved in the fighting here. So you're talking about small scale battles most often. Charlemagne does, he's working to push back the Islamic presence in southern Iberia. So, he's recognizing that there are boundaries to his empire and wanting to push back and push around. I think he's using the ancient world, but he's a medieval man.
I think this also harkens to another thing that I commonly associate with medieval versus ancient, which is the clear decline in army size and like the complexities of certain military exercises and campaigns. Now, I can't say that, for everything because I don't know, but from an outsider looking in, it feels like when you get to the early medieval period that the armies, they're not on the scale of earlier Roman imperial expeditions against Parthia or Sasanian Persia and the like, which, as you said, is that testament to that new, I'm not using the dreaded F word, feudal word at all there, because that's me being an idiot. But maybe the systems of power, right?
I mean, you can use the F word. You're free to use the F word. It's your video.
I don't know. You tell me.
But I think the key thing there is that Rome has the key difference, the key marker is that Rome has a standing army paid for by the empire. throughout the medieval period, you simply don't have countries till very, very late having anything that resembles a standing army. You're raising the feudal levies. You're calling in people who owe you allegiance and owe you military service to act as your army. So there's a clear divide there, I think, between the ancient world where regimes had standing armies that they trained and paid for and could deploy wherever they wanted to, and the medieval world where this is a much more kind of makeshift. You don't incur the cost of a huge standing army.
Do you think that's also what makes Belisarius's expedition to North Italy and Italy ultimately so remarkable? Because it feels like an ancient history military expedition, but in a changing world. But this idea that you could send, you might not see it until maybe the Crusades later or something like that, where you can get an army from a power, to ferry across the Mediterranean and then start a campaign afresh. I'm hearkening back also to doing Rome 2 Total War and the Belisarius campaign. but I hope you know what I mean. It's that idea that such an idea may feel unfathomable to early medieval periods. I'm sure there are like the Normans and Sicily might be a contrast, but I don't know. But
it does lean into, again, what we're saying, that the ancient world hasn't gone away. People are recognizing that there's a need to do things in a new and different way, but that doesn't mean you can't try the old stuff. Throughout the medieval period, the prevailing military wisdom is Vegetius from the end of the Roman Empire. They will completely and utterly lean on him till the end of the medieval period. So there is still a recognition that the ancient world knew how to do some things.
Very true. All right, well, let's keep going on. Okay, this is an interesting one. Emperor Constantine, so early 4th century.
Wait, did you just steal Charlemagne?
Yeah, sorry, I did. My bad. That's
you.
yours. Yeah, that wouldn't look good, would it? Yes, Emperor Constantine. What main achievements? Yes, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Of course, what's he most associated with? Christianity. And it will always be debated, why he embraces Christianity at the Milvian Bridge. The Cairo story, Eusebius, and so on. But he does, he's part of the Tetrarchy, that rule of 4 that I mentioned earlier. But then, after a series of civil wars, becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Obviously, his other big legacy is the founding of Constantinople, or the renaming of Byzantium to Constantinople, and then making his own seat of power. Although it will not straight away be like the great centre of the Roman Empire. Once again, David Gwynn, encyclopedia on this stuff, saying how Theodosius the Great, so much later in the 4th century, is more that Constantinople is clearly the centre. But the question here is, like, does he lay the foundations, I guess, for the Eastern Roman, the Byzantine Empire?
I would be tempted, controversially, to make a hard play for Constantine.
Would you? Interesting. So you're going to make a play for 328, early 4th century?
In that, what is the medieval period but the story of the emergence and the ascendancy of the Roman Church?
Very true.
The adoption of Christianity is the beginning of that process. And when I said earlier that, as far as I'm aware, Rome has this economy that doesn't kind of produce and export anything. The sudden realization that it needs to produce and export something comes along. And what does it export? It exports religion, Christianity. And who starts that? Constantine does. Here is a man who is realizing that Rome needs to change. And here is the man who gives it its main export.
Well, he was a man who realised that Rome needs to change, even though Christians are just like 5% of the empire's population at the time.
I guess ahead of his time.
Well, I know. I think he's David Potter. I interviewed one of the first interviews I ever did on the podcast, but I remember him saying this, mentioning how he thinks Constantine was hedging his bets. You'll see coins. His clear link to Christianity. Only gets baptized when he's on his deathbed, so in the 330s. You also have coins of Constantine, I think it's with Sol Invictus and the like. So I'd still say it's a transitional faith. I get what you mean.
But he's he's set in motion.
Yes.
The things that will ultimately define the medieval period.
He does. I think you could do a legacy of Constantine and that would be medieval because he's such a big figure. I would not be allowed to get away with saying that Constantine the Great is a medieval figure ahead of his time. I just don't, because he's still very much in that imperial system. He reverts to one-man rule of the entire empire, and he's successful, largely because there aren't any big threats from the Persians or on the Rhine at that time.
Although I'd also say someone who's, there's a couple of other kings around him until he beats them up and becomes sole ruler is very medieval.
Would you? Well, yeah, but Rome also has precedents for doing that with, rival claimants for the throne. You've got so many civil wars.
I just feel like you're getting too many here. Just making a bid for Constantine.
Put them in the middle. In the middle. All right, fine. You'd have to think very carefully how you did a Gone Medieval episode about Constantine the Great. That's all I'll say.
Otherwise, you'd ambush me in the office again.
You did what? This is a very interesting one, though. So, 628, 630s West Asia, which, is the Arab conquests, rise of Islam. Would you like to say something first about it?
I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting things, because I think lots of people will immediately think that has to be medieval. But the rise of Islam on the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire is fascinating, because the medieval world, like I say, after the Crusades, when the medieval world in Western Europe comes back into contact with lots of the teachings of Rome and Greece, they get that from their Muslim enemies. And I think the Muslims would argue, there's this kind of mini enlightenment in Western Europe when all of that knowledge and power comes back. I think Muslims in the Near East would argue that they never forgot all of that ancient wisdom in the way that Western Europe had. They come into contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, and as far as they're concerned, it's still the Roman Empire. I think there are lots of ways, as much as I hate shooting myself in the foot, I think there are lots of interesting ways in which the Arab world has a stronger connection to the ancient world than medieval Europe does by this point.
It's interesting because we're doing that geographic shift, aren't we? This is the first one where we're kind of talking beyond Europe and the Mediterranean basin. And you do make the points how, before that, you have a situation in West Asia that has been there for centuries. The fact that you've got west of the Euphrates, the Romans, and east of the Euphrates, the Persians, right? And it's been that kind of fighting back and forth for centuries, whether it's Sasanians, Parthians, those are the main two with the Romans, aren't they? So it is very interesting that you have that context of, you could argue, two ancient superpowers. So when we did do this episode on the ancients recently, we kind of framed it as such, this is the story of the fall of one of those superpowers in the Sasanian Persians. And also the the decline of another one west of the Euphrates, and the story how that power balance, two superpowers ruling Mesopotamia, Syria area, that thing that's been there forever and people expected, would just return to as it had been before, is completely derailed by the Arab conquests, by the taking of Persia, by the uniting of both sides of the Euphrates under one caliphate.
Because I think the tricky thing is, if you said 635 and the rise of Islam, people would say medieval. If you said a rising Arab superpower that fights the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, that sounds incredibly ancient.
I think it stretches both, which once again shows how permeable medieval ancient is, and you can't put a direct date on it. But the fact is, the spread of Islam so quickly and those armies after that, Egypt, and then, as you mentioned earlier, all the way ultimately to Morocco and southern Spain, that is clearly medieval. So I think it is very much on the verge. Maybe I'll leave this topic by saying how there is even debate amongst the scholars. And talking to Dr. Khodadad Rezahani recently, he jokingly kind of quips back the First Great War of the medieval period.
So if we conceded Constantine belongs somewhere in the middle, do we think this probably belongs somewhere in the middle as well?
Yeah, go on then, I think so. But it's funny, isn't it? Once again, it shows how you've got someone from the 4th century there, someone from the 7th century there. I will always say that Constantine is still ancient, but I can see that the conception of it potentially being there. The last one is, got to do it quick fire. I'm being urged to hurry on by the people behind the cameras now. But this is a bit of a curveball. Mesoamerica. Does ancient medieval crossover, does it apply to Mesoamerica?
I don't think it can.
I don't think it can either.
It's so tricky, because I think if you said Aztecs and Mayans, people would think you're talking about ancient civilizations.
Oh, I disagree. I think Aztecs, no, because they have direct contact with the Spanish. That Aztecs and Inca, I would hesitate against doing on the Ancients podcast, because I think it's so, it's within 600, 700 years or so, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the others, yes. I don't know.
But it's tricky then to put a date on when do you medievalize that, because you can talk, late 15th century when Europeans arrived, but that's suggesting that somehow the Europeans are bringing something new and brilliant rather than destroying what's already there. So I think it's South America and the Americas are one of those places where it's really, really difficult to periodize history in the same way as we do in Europe.
Because you've done Cahokia, haven't you? That and I must admit, Cahokia in North America, great earthen mound and a great city, wasn't it, in North America? Is one I have thought once in a while about doing, but I still think it was too far ahead that I hesitated to do it and say it was ancient history.
Yeah. It feels like it should be medieval, but that's us sitting in Europe probably projecting our ideas across, and there are places like China, Japan that we could talk about where they just simply wouldn't recognize the periodization of history that we use in Western Europe, and I think probably the Americas is the same.
But it's interesting with China and India as other ones. China is like, sometimes they love a big date. You'll put like the end of the Han dynasty, so 3rd century, or the beginning of the Tang. One of those dynasties there, that's the medieval period start. In India, they might say it's the fall of the Guptas, and then that from on is the time of medieval period. So it almost feels like there's more clear cut because of that Eurasian landmass. And there is connection. I think that there is more easy to put a pinpoint between ancient medieval with India and China, whereas Mesoamerica, different.
Yeah. I think China, the Tang dynasty in the 7th century starts to feel very, very medieval. That very quickly moves its way, the principles of that, to Japan as well. And they get the Taika reforms in Japan in the kind of mid 7th century. And it starts to feel much more like a feudal, what we might recognize as a medieval society. But again, it's just tricky to do it everywhere all at once.
Well, that's it. We'll put that as once again a kind of an undecided one in the middle. So how do you feel?
What's the score's the only important thing?
I've got 3. I would claim Constantine, but I'm going to put Constantine.
Score draw.
Fine. We'll do a score. All right. Diplomatic end to the chat. But yeah, that was good fun.
I think it's been really interesting and very, very interesting to actually think about some people who you might think of as medieval might have actually lived before people that you think of as, or events that you think of as ancient, and just how blurry and porous that border between us is. So maybe you should stop beating me up in the office and we should just be friends.
I know. I'm just too competitive in that regard. But no, it's been great. And finally, we've had you on the podcast, my friend. And, it's always nice to do a history hit crossover when we can, especially for time period podcasts where it's more difficult to get those crossovers. But it feels like a nice topic to do, friendly conversation, and lots of room for people to debate. So let us know your thoughts in the comments, because I'm sure you've got quite a lot. Matt, it just goes to me to say thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been an absolute joy. Thank you, Tristan.